world did not grow crueler. You simply stopped looking away. Marcus Aurelius wrote that everything is opinion, and opinion is entirely within our power to remove. 2,000 years before you were born to doubt it, he had already found the answer to the question that keeps you awake at night.
You believe the world has become crueler. You believe people lie more, betray more, care less, and that violence has crawled into every corner of a life that once felt safer. You did not invent this belief. You built it slowly, one headline at a time, one disappointment at a time, until it hardened into a fact you no longer question. But a fact is not the same as a judgment, and this is where your mistake begins. Before you accept that the world has darkened, you must first ask a harder question. Has the world truly changed, or has your eye simply learned to notice what it once refused to see? 2,000 years ago, a man born into slavery answered this question before you were ever born to ask it. Epictetus did not have comfort, status, or freedom, yet he built a doctrine so precise that it still cuts through modern confusion with the same edge it had in Rome. He taught that no event wounds you directly. It is never the insult, the betrayal, or the violence itself that disturbs your peace. It is the judgment you silently attach to it, the story you tell yourself about what it means, what it threatens, and what it says about the world you live in. Strip away the judgment and the event stands alone, indifferent, waiting for your mind to decide what weight it deserves. Marcus Aurelius knew this same truth from a very different seat. He held more power than any man of his age, commanded armies, buried his own children, and watched empires strain under plague and war. And yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, writing only for himself, he did not accuse the world of malice. He reminded himself again and again that the universe is neutral, that events arrive without intention, and that only the mind adds venom or peace to what unfolds. If the most powerful man in the world needed this discipline to survive his own perception, what makes you believe you are exempt from needing it too? Consider a lawman who spends his life chasing violence he can no longer explain. He does not know if the world has grown darker or if he has simply grown tired of carrying its weight. He searches for an answer in the deaths he cannot prevent and the cruelty he cannot outrun, and slowly he begins to suspect that the darkness was never new. It only became visible once he stopped looking away from it. This is not a story about a broken world. It is a story about an aging mind confronting a truth it spent decades avoiding. You are no different. Every year, your senses collect more proof of the world's harshness, not because harshness increased, but because your filter for it changed. Children believe the world is safe because they have not yet learned to notice danger. Adults believe the world is dangerous because they have spent years training themselves to notice nothing else. Neither perception is objective. Both are constructed, shaped by attention, memory, and fear, long before they are ever confirmed by fact. Seneca warned that most suffering comes not from what happens to us, but from our own imagination of what might happen, has happened, or will happen again. He called this the tax we pay in advance for troubles we have not yet lived through, and often will never live through at all. If Seneca could name this trap in the wealthiest, most anxious city of his time, you should suspect the same trap is operating quietly inside your own mind today. This is not an invitation to deny that suffering exists. Cruelty is real, loss is real. Betrayal happens, and pretending otherwise would insult the philosophy we are about to study. But there is a profound difference between acknowledging that darkness exists and believing that darkness has grown simply because you have grown more aware of it. Confusing the two is not wisdom. It is exhaustion disguised as insight. In this video, we will dismantle that confusion piece by piece, using the precise tools the Stoics left behind. We will examine the doctrine Epictetus built to separate fact from judgment. We will study how Marcus Aurelius applied that doctrine while ruling an empire in crisis. We will look honestly at how memory distorts the past into something gentler than it ever was, and we will ask, without flinching, whether the version of the world you fear today is truth, or simply the shape your own mind has learned to project onto it. Topic 1. The Doctrine Epictetus, built from nothing. Picture a man who owns nothing. No house, no title, no protection under the law, his body itself the property of another man who could beat him, sell him, or break his leg without consequence. This was Epictetus before he was ever a philosopher, a slave in the household of a secretary to the Emperor Nero, a man with every external reason to believe the world was as cruel as it could possibly be. And yet from this exact position, stripped of everything you currently fear losing, he built one of the most precise psychological instruments in the history of human thought. If anyone had the right to declare the world irredeemably dark, it was him. Instead, he built a doctrine that refused to let the world make that decision for him. At the center of his teaching sits a distinction so simple it is almost insulting, and so demanding that most people spend their entire lives failing to apply it. Epictetus divided existence into two categories: what is up to us and what is not up to us. Our judgments, our desires, our aversions, our will, these belong entirely to us. Our body, our reputation, our possessions, the actions of others, and the events of the world belong to fate, to chance, to forces entirely outside our control. This is not a comforting platitude. It is a surgical separation between the only territory where you hold real power and the vast territory where you hold none at all, no matter how convinced you are otherwise. Now apply this to your belief that the world has darkened. The event itself, the crime on the news, the betrayal in your family, the stranger who cut you off in traffic and screamed through his window, these belong to the category outside your control. They happened, or they did not, independent of your opinion about them. But the moment you decide what that event means, whether it proves the world is collapsing, whether it confirms that people cannot be trusted, whether it justifies your growing certainty that safety was always an illusion, you have crossed into the only territory Epictetus said actually belongs to you. That judgment is yours. You built it. And because you built it, you can also take it apart. Epictetus called this the difference between the impression, fantasia in the original Greek, and the assent we give to it, synchatathesis. An impression arrives uninvited. You see the headline, you hear the argument, you witness the unkindness. This part is automatic, and Epictetus never asked anyone to pretend otherwise. But between the impression and your belief about it sits a gap, a narrow space where judgment is formed and where your consent is required before that impression hardens into conviction. Most people never notice this gap exists. They treat the impression and the belief as a single inseparable event, arriving together, demanding acceptance together. Epictetus spent his entire teaching career trying to widen that gap for his students, because he knew that whoever controls the gap controls their entire experience of reality. This is precisely where your certainty about a darkening world begins to unravel. You are not actually reacting to more cruelty than existed 20 years ago. You are reacting to a mind that has spent 20 years accumulating impressions, storing them, connecting them, and eventually giving them a name: decline, danger, moral collapse. Each new headline does not create this belief. It confirms a belief that was already assembled long before, brick by brick, impression by impression, until the structure felt less like an opinion and more like an unquestionable fact about the nature of existence itself. Epictetus would ask you a question that sounds almost cruel in its simplicity. What exactly is not up to you in this situation? The cruelty of a stranger, not up to you. The chaos reported on the news, not up to you. The choices of people who disappointed you, not up to you. What remains once you remove everything outside your control is only your judgment about what all of this means for the character of the world itself. And that judgment, uncomfortably, was always yours alone to construct. He gave his students a practice for this, one that sounds deceptively small but reshapes an entire worldview when applied with discipline. Whenever a disturbing impression arrives, pause before granting it your agreement. Ask what part of this is fact and what part is interpretation. Ask whether you are responding to the event or to the story you have already told yourself about what events like this one always mean. This single pause, repeated daily, is the entire mechanism by which a man with nothing convinced himself that no external circumstance, however brutal, could dictate the condition of his inner world. You are not asked to deny that suffering exists in the world. Epictetus never denied the whip that could fall on his own back. You are asked only to notice where the true battle is actually taking place, not in the world outside you, but in the narrow, contested space between what arrives and what you choose to believe about it. Topic 2. The Emperor who refused to blame the world. Now step away from the slave and stand instead in the tent of the most powerful man alive, somewhere on the frozen frontier of the Danube, where Marcus Aurelius spent the final years of his life, fighting wars he never wanted against tribes that would not stop arriving. He had buried multiple children. He had watched a plague, likely brought home by his own returning legions, kill perhaps a tenth of the empire he ruled. He faced betrayal from a trusted general who declared himself emperor, while Marcus was still alive to hear the news. If any human being in history had earned the right to declare the world irredeemably dark, it was a man burying his sons while commanding armies against an endless winter war. And yet the private notebook he kept, never intended for publication, never written to inspire anyone but himself, contains almost no accusation against the world at all. This is the detail most people miss when they quote him for decoration. Marcus Aurelius was not performing wisdom for an audience. He was the exhausted, grieving, overworked man, writing reminders to himself in the dark, because even an emperor needed to relearn Epictetus's doctrine every single day. And even supreme power granted no immunity from the temptation to believe the world had turned cruel. His writings, later gathered as the Meditations, read less like philosophy and more like a man gripping the same rope again and again so he would not drown in his own perception of catastrophe. He wrote that the things themselves do not touch the soul at all, not in the slightest degree, and have no power to shape our judgment. It is only our own inner opinion that has this power. Read that again, and notice how directly it echoes the slave's doctrine from a generation before him. Marcus was not inventing a new idea. He was applying an old one under a pressure most of us will never face. Wars he could not win quickly, sons he could not save, a body increasingly worn down by illness, and a Senate that whispered doubts about his fitness to rule. If the events of his life had the power to darken the world on their own, his notebook would be a record of despair. Instead, it is a record of a man refusing, entry after entry, to let catastrophe write his conclusions for him. Consider what he wrote about the people who angered him, the colleagues who betrayed him, the soldiers who failed him. He reminded himself before rising each morning that he would meet people who were meddling, ungrateful, insolent, deceitful, envious, and unsociable. And rather than concluding that this proved humanity was collapsing, he reminded himself that these flaws come from ignorance of what is good and evil, and that he himself shared the same nature as these people, the same capacity for reason, and therefore no external unkindness could truly injure him unless he allowed his own judgment to call it an injury. This was not naivety. He commanded armies, he signed executions, he understood cruelty intimately. He simply refused to let cruelty dictate his interior verdict about existence itself. There is a particular passage where he addresses the very question this video is built around, whether the world has grown worse or whether perception has simply narrowed. He observed that everything is the same, familiar in experience, ephemeral in duration, and coarse in material, and that all things now are as they were in the age of those buried long before us. He was reminding himself that the plague he now faced, the treachery he now suffered, the grief now consuming his household, were not new inventions of a darkening universe. They were the same forces that had always tested human beings, dressed in different names for a different century. What had changed was not the world's cruelty. What had changed was his proximity to it, his tiredness, his grief narrowing his field of vision until cruelty appeared to be everywhere, simply because it was, for a time, closer to him than it had ever been before. This is precisely the trap you fall into when you conclude the world has darkened with age. You are not measuring the world. You are measuring your accumulated proximity to its pain, mistaking nearness for magnitude, mistaking familiarity with suffering for an increase in suffering itself. Marcus Aurelius, buried in grief that would break most men, still returned each morning to the same discipline the slave had taught a generation earlier, separating the event from the verdict, refusing to let personal exhaustion write a universal indictment against existence. He never denied the war. He never denied the plague. He never denied his own grief. What he refused again and again in notebook after notebook was the conclusion that any of this proved the world itself had turned against him. That refusal, repeated daily under more pressure than you will likely ever face, is the discipline this entire video is asking you to consider before you accept your own quiet verdict that the world has darkened simply because you have grown tired of carrying what it has always contained. Topic 3. Seneca and the debt you pay for a crime that never happened. Seneca lived inside the wealthiest, most anxious city the ancient world had ever produced, advising an emperor who would eventually order his death, watching Rome's elite destroy themselves through paranoia, excess, and the constant expectation that catastrophe was always one step behind them. If Epictetus diagnosed the mechanism of judgment, and Marcus Aurelius demonstrated it, under the pressure of grief and war, Seneca turned his attention to something more specific and, for you, more uncomfortable. He turned his attention to the suffering you invent before anything has even happened at all. He wrote to his friend Lucilius that there are more things that terrify us than injure us, and that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Sit with that claim honestly. Most of what convinces you the world has darkened is not composed of events you directly experienced. It is composed of anticipated danger, second-hand catastrophe, headlines about crimes committed against strangers in cities you have never visited, statistics stripped of context, warnings repeated so often they calcify into certainty. Seneca called this advance payment on a debt you may never actually owe, a tax collected daily by your own imagination, spent on threats that frequently never arrive, and even when they do arrive, rarely resemble the version your mind had already rehearsed 100 times in advance. This matters enormously for the question this video is built around. When you conclude the world has grown crueler, you are rarely drawing only from what has happened directly to you. You are drawing from an accumulated archive of anticipated cruelty, curated over years by a mind trained to notice threat and discount safety, because threat once mattered more for survival than calm ever did. Seneca understood this asymmetry 2,000 years before modern psychology gave it careful names. He warned that the imagined version of suffering is almost always worse than suffering itself, more relentless, less merciful, because imagination has no natural limit the way reality eventually does. Reality resolves. Imagination repeats itself endlessly, refining its own horror with each replay. He also warned about a particular danger that speaks directly to anyone convinced the world has aged badly alongside them. He observed that we are in the habit of magnifying, or inventing or anticipating sorrow, and that the mind which constantly rehearses disaster gradually loses the ability to distinguish between what has actually occurred and what it has merely feared with enough intensity to feel real. This is not a flaw unique to weak character. Seneca diagnosed it in senators, generals, and wealthy men surrounded by guards, precisely because status and safety provide no immunity against a mind determined to manufacture its own catastrophe. Consider how this operates in your own accumulating certainty about the world's decline. Each year adds new material to the archive, a crime witnessed only through a screen, a betrayal suffered once and generalized into a rule about all future trust, a single loss mistaken for evidence of a universal pattern. Seneca would ask whether you have actually verified that the world has produced more cruelty than it always contained, or whether you have simply grown more efficient at collecting, storing, and rehearsing every instance of cruelty you encounter, while your memory quietly discards the countless ordinary kindnesses that never registered as noteworthy enough to keep. This is the cruelest trick memory plays on an aging mind. Kindness rarely announces itself. It moves through your days unmarked, unremarkable, forgotten within hours because nothing about safety demands your attention the way danger does. Cruelty, by contrast, brands itself permanently, replayed at 3 a.m, cited as proof whenever the subject of a darkening world arises. You are not comparing 2 decades of actual experience. You are comparing a curated archive of threat against a childhood you remember, inaccurately, as a place without shadows, when in truth it simply contains shadows you are not yet equipped to notice. Seneca offered a discipline against this distortion, one that demands more honesty than comfort. He insisted that before assenting to fear, you examine whether the danger is present, certain, and real, or merely imagined, exaggerated, or borrowed from someone else's catastrophe. He asked his students to interrogate every anticipated disaster with a simple, unforgiving question. Has this actually happened, or have I simply decided it will, and paid the emotional price in advance, regardless of the outcome? This question, applied honestly to your belief that the world has darkened, forces you to separate verified experience from accumulated dread, real loss from anticipated collapse, memory from mythology. None of this denies that Rome burned, that emperors murdered rivals, that Seneca himself would eventually be ordered to open his own veins on the command of a man he once tutored. He never asked anyone to pretend cruelty was fictional. He asked only that you stop paying daily and in advance for every cruelty your imagination insists is coming, and that you stop mistaking the weight of anticipated suffering for evidence that the world itself has grown heavier than it has ever been. Topic 4. The lawman who could not tell if the world had changed or he had. There is a certain kind of man who spends his entire career standing between ordinary people and violence, and who eventually reaches an age where he can no longer tell whether the violence itself has changed or whether he has simply grown too tired to keep pretending it hasn't always been this way. This figure appears across generations and professions: the aging sheriff, the retiring detective, the old soldier who no longer recognizes the war he once understood completely. He is not a philosopher. He does not quote Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius. But his confusion is the exact confusion this entire video has been dismantling piece by piece, and watching it unfold in a single exhausted mind makes the doctrine impossible to ignore. Picture this man near the end of his service, sitting across from an old colleague, trying to explain a feeling he cannot quite justify with evidence. He describes a violence that feels different now, faster, colder, without the old rules that once, in his memory, governed even the worst men he had faced. He is not lying about his feeling. The feeling is completely real to him, but notice what he is actually comparing. He is comparing decades of accumulated exposure to danger, layered and thickened by every case he carried home and never fully put down, against a memory of his early years that has been quietly, mercifully simplified by time into something gentler than it ever truly was. This is the exact mechanism Seneca warned you about in the previous chapter, an archive weighted entirely toward threat, compared against a past edited by forgetting. The lawman does not remember every ordinary, uneventful night from his first years on the job, because uneventful nights leave no mark worth keeping. He remembers the violence, all of it, compounding year after year, until the total weight of everything he has personally witnessed feels heavier than anything the world could have contained when he was young and still learning to notice danger at all. His conclusion that the world has darkened is not dishonest. It is simply built from an incomplete ledger, one side overflowing with proof, the other side emptied by the ordinary mercy of memory. Now apply Epictetus directly to this man's confusion. The crimes themselves, the specific acts of violence he encountered across his career, belong entirely to the category outside his control. They happened. He witnessed them. No Stoic doctrine asks him to deny a single one. But his conclusion that this proves the world has become fundamentally worse than it once was, that verdict belongs entirely to him, constructed from impressions he never paused to examine before granting them his full agreement. He never asked whether he was responding to an actual increase in cruelty or to his own accumulating proximity to it, layered daily until proximity felt indistinguishable from proof. Marcus Aurelius would recognize this man immediately, because it mirrors his own temptation during years of plague and war on the frontier. Grief and exhaustion do not just make the world feel darker. They physically narrow attention until darkness is the only material left available to notice. The emperor's discipline was to keep reminding himself each morning that the same forces had always existed, dressed differently across centuries, and that his own nearness to suffering was not evidence that suffering itself had multiplied. The lawman never received this training. He carried the weight without ever being taught the doctrine that could have helped him set part of it down. And so he reaches the end of his service believing the world betrayed him, when in truth, it simply asked him, for decades, to stand closer to its oldest and most permanent shadow than most people ever have to. This is precisely the danger facing you as you accumulate your own years and your own archive of proof. You do not need a badge or a war to build the same distorted ledger. Every scroll through frightening news, every second-hand account of cruelty, every personal betrayal generalized into a rule about all future trust, adds another entry to a private archive that feels, over time, like undeniable evidence of a world in decline. And exactly like the lawman, you rarely notice the countless unremarkable days quietly missing from the other side of that ledger, discarded by a memory that was never designed to preserve the ordinary at the same rate it preserves the alarming. The Stoic response is not to tell this man or you that violence is fictional, that cruelty never happened, that decades of witnessed suffering should simply be dismissed. Epictetus never asked for that. Marcus Aurelius never asked for that. Seneca certainly never asked for that. What they demanded, consistently and without exception, was the harder discipline of separating the event, real, witnessed, undeniable, from the verdict layered on top of it, the conclusion that this proves the entire world has grown irredeemably worse than the one you were born into. That verdict is never handed to you by the evidence itself. It is constructed quietly, inside a mind that has simply spent too long standing too close to the only kind of proof it was ever trained to notice. Topic 5. The discipline you carry home. Finally, you must decide what to do with everything laid bare across this journey, because understanding a doctrine changes nothing if it remains only an interesting idea you nodded along to and then quietly abandoned the moment a frightening headline appeared on your screen tomorrow morning. Epictetus did not build his distinction between what is up to us and what is not up to us so that you could admire it. He built it as a daily practice, repeated under pressure, refined through failure, because he understood that knowing a truth and living by it are separated by a gap most people never cross. Return to the exact question this video opened with. Has the world truly darkened, or has your own perception simply matured into something heavier than it once was? You now have the tools to answer this honestly, instead of emotionally. When the next disturbing impression arrives, and it will arrive, perhaps within hours of finishing this video, pause in the narrow space Epictetus spent his life trying to widen. Ask what part of what you are feeling is fact, verified, present, undeniable, and what part is judgment, assembled from years of accumulated proximity to suffering, weighted by a memory that quietly discarded every ordinary kindness that never earned a place in your archive of proof. Remember Marcus Aurelius, gripping the same rope morning after morning, not because he found peace easily, but precisely because he did not. An emperor burying his own children still needed this discipline daily. This should not discourage you. It should relieve you. You are not failing at something that comes naturally to wiser men. You are attempting something that required constant renewal, even for a man commanding the most powerful army on earth. The goal was never to reach a permanent state of calm immunity. The goal was the daily return to the same discipline again and again, for as long as you are alive to need it. Remember Seneca's warning about debts paid in advance for catastrophes that may never arrive, and notice how much of your certainty about a darkening world was never actually verified experience at all, but rehearsed fear, borrowed dread, second-hand catastrophe absorbed through screens designed specifically to hold your attention through alarm. You are permitted to stop paying that tax. You are permitted to ask, before granting your fear its authority, whether this danger is present and certain or merely anticipated and borrowed. And remember the lawman, reaching the end of his service convinced the world had betrayed him, when in truth, he had simply stood closer to its oldest shadow for longer than most people ever have to, without ever being taught that proximity to suffering is not the same as an increase in suffering itself. Do not let his story become a prophecy for your own later years. You have been given, across this video, exactly what he never received, the doctrine that could have let him set part of that weight down before it hardened into a verdict against the entire world. None of this asks you to become numb, indifferent, or blind to real cruelty. The Stoics were not men who denied suffering. Epictetus carried the marks of his own bondage. Marcus Aurelius buried more grief than most men will ever be asked to carry. Seneca died by the very violence he spent his life examining. They did not build this doctrine from safety. They built it from direct, undeniable contact with the worst the world can offer, and concluded every time that the world's cruelty was never the true battlefield. The battlefield was always the narrow, contested space between what happens and what you decide it means, and that space, unlike the world itself, remains entirely yours to govern. So the next time you feel certain that the world has grown darker with every passing year, pause before you grant that feeling your full agreement. Ask whether you are measuring the world or measuring your own accumulated nearness to its oldest and most permanent shadow. The world you were born into contained exactly this much cruelty and exactly this much kindness all along. What changed was never its nature. What changed was how closely you were eventually forced to look at it, and whether you ever learned, as these three men did, to separate what arrived from what you chose to believe it meant.